Welcome back, friends. Tonight, we're diving deep into three unsettling tales where art, isolation, and ancient mysteries come alive. We'll explore the twisted obsessions of an artist, uncover the secrets of a hidden mountain community, and follow a haunting melody on a foggy shoreline that might just be calling someone home. If you're ready for an evening that will chill you to the bone, make sure to hit like, subscribe, and prepare to be drawn into these eerie worlds. Let's begin. The Sculptors Curse. I moved to Philadelphia last spring to pursue a graduate program in fine arts. Sculpture had been my passion for as long as I could remember, and I'd heard of a workshop in an old building downtown that rented out spaces to artists. The price was decent and the space was perfect for what I needed. The building itself was ancient, with creaky wooden floors, exposed brick walls, and a damp, musty smell that never seemed to go away. I didn't mind. It added to the character. My fellow artists were quiet, often keeping to themselves, but there was one exception. A sculptor named Tom, whose work was unlike anything I'd seen. His sculptures had a dark, twisted edge to them. Faces contorted in pain, hands reaching out as if for help. It was mesmerizing but disturbing. One evening, while working late, Tom invited me to his space. He was eager to show me his latest piece, a life-sized figure of a man caught in a moment of anguish, as though frozen in mid-scream. I couldn't help but admire the detail, but something about it felt off. It was almost too lifelike, as though he'd captured a real person's suffering. "I study people's expressions in depth," Tom said with a strange smile. "I look for moments when they're not posing, when they're most vulnerable." I was impressed by his dedication but disturbed by his intensity. From then on, I noticed Tom's work seemed to get even darker. Each new piece looked more tortured than the last. He seemed obsessed, often staying at the studio all night, muttering to himself as he sculpted. I assumed it was just part of his process, but then things started happening. One night as I was working late, I noticed Tom sitting alone, staring at his latest piece with an intense expression. The light was dim, casting shadows across his face, and for a moment, I could have sworn the sculpture was moving as though its eyes were following me. I shook it off as exhaustion and went back to my workspace, but the feeling of being watched lingered. Over the next few weeks, Tom became increasingly withdrawn and his behavior grew erratic. I'd hear him talking to himself, sometimes arguing, as if someone else were in the room. His sculptures became even more disturbing, hands clawing at faces, bodies twisted in unnatural ways. He'd whisper to them as he worked, and once, I overheard him saying, "You belong to me now." Then one evening, Tom disappeared. His workspace was left as it was, tools scattered, half-finished sculptures in various stages of creation. No one had seen him leave, and he hadn't taken any of his belongings. The landlord concerned contacted the police. They investigated but didn't find any clues as to where he'd gone. Days turned into weeks and Tom's absence became a mystery. Some artists joked that he'd become one of his sculptures, a morbid comment that didn't sit well with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened, and I started avoiding the studio late at night. One evening, as I was about to leave, I noticed a sculpture in Tom's workspace that hadn't been there before. It was a figure hunched over, its face obscured by hands, as though hiding from something. I didn't remember seeing it, and the resemblance to Tom was unsettling. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to take a closer look. The detail was remarkable, down to the faint lines on the hands and the wrinkles in the clothing. But as I circled the piece, I noticed something strange. Tom's keychain, partially hidden beneath the base. The same one he always wore with a small charm from his mother. A chill ran down my spine. I called the landlord, who seemed just as unnerved. We called the police, who arrived within the hour and cordoned off the area. After a closer inspection, they found Tom's fingerprints on the sculpture, confirming he'd recently worked on it. But they couldn't explain why his personal items were embedded within the piece or why he'd left so abruptly without a trace. The building was closed for several days as the investigation continued. The police interviewed us, but none of us had answers. Tom had been an eccentric artist. but he hadn't shown any signs of wanting to leave. When the building reopened, I decided to clear out my workspace. The atmosphere had changed. What was once a place of creativity now felt oppressive, haunted by whatever secrets Tom had left behind. To this day, I can't shake the image of that sculpture, the haunting way it seemed to embody Tom's own spirit. Some of the artists who stayed claimed to hear whispers near his old workspace, low voices that fade into the night. And though I've tried to move on, I can still see his work in my mind, those faces frozen in torment, staring out as if trapped. I often wonder if Tom found what he was looking for, or if in the end it found him. The Secret of Boulder Pines. I moved to Boulder, Colorado last year, drawn by the mountains and the promise of a slower pace. My job as a newspaper reporter had taken me to small towns before, but Boulder had a particular charm that felt like a fresh start. That was until I stumbled onto a story that would make me question everything. It began with whispers about a local community on the outskirts of town, a close-knit group known as Boulder Pines. They kept to themselves, rarely interacted with outsiders, and had their own strange traditions. One of my sources told me they were holding their annual fall harvest dinner and hinted there was something odd about it. Normally, I wouldn't have given it a second thought, but the mention of odd and secretive piqued my curiosity. So on a chilly October evening, I drove up the winding road that led to Boulder Pines. The forest thickened around me, swallowing up the last traces of daylight. By the time I arrived, darkness had settled, and an eerie quiet hung in the air. There was no gate, no fence, just a narrow dirt road leading to a collection of cabins nestled among the trees. As I approached, I saw a large barn-like structure at the center of the settlement. Candles lined the windows and smoke curled up from a chimney, filling the air with a strange, sweet smell that made my stomach turn. I parked at a distance and walked quietly, hoping to observe without drawing attention. The barn doors were slightly ajar, allowing me to peek inside. The townsfolk were gathered around a long table, lit only by candles. They were passing around platters of food, meat, vegetables, and what looked like homemade breads and pies. But there was something off about the scene. Everyone's expressions were blank, eyes fixed forward, as though they were in some kind of trance. Then, one by one, they stood and turned to face a tall figure standing at the head of the table. A man with gray hair and piercing eyes, who seemed to command their undivided attention. He began to speak in a low, measured tone, his voice barely above a whisper, yet everyone seemed riveted. "Tonight," he said, "we honor the spirits that protect our land, the ones who have kept Boulder Pines safe and hidden. We give thanks and return what was given." At that, the townsfolk chanted in unison, their voices blending into a haunting melody. I strained to make out the words, but they were in a language I didn't recognize. The sweet smell grew stronger, mingling with something else, a metallic tang that turned my stomach. I took a step back, careful not to make a sound. I decided to head back to my car, planning to come back in daylight when I could safely ask some questions. But as I turned, I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whipped around to find myself face to face with an older woman, her face worn and expressionless. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, her eyes darting to the barn. "They don't like outsiders." I stammered an apology, claiming I'd gotten lost, but she didn't seem to believe me. She looked past me to the barn, her face filled with a fear I couldn't understand. "Go," she urged. "Don't look back." I didn't need any more convincing. I hurried to my car, the eerie chanting still echoing in my ears. The drive back was a blur, my mind racing with questions. What had I stumbled upon? The next morning, I decided to do some research. I dug through the town's archives, looking for any mention of Boulder Pines. To my surprise, records were sparse. The community was barely mentioned, as though it had been deliberately kept off the grid. But one article caught my eye. A story about a series of disappearances over the years, all involving people who had last been seen near Boulder Pines. I tried to interview people around town, but no one wanted to talk about it. Most pretended they didn't know what I was asking about. while a few gave me cautious warnings to let it be. It was clear that whatever was happening up there, the locals knew, and they wanted no part of it. Over the next few days, I found myself unable to focus on anything else. Something about that gathering, that strange ceremony, and the disappearances gnawed at me. Against my better judgment, I decided to go back up to Boulder Pines that evening, determined to get answers. As I arrived, I noticed the place was empty. The cabins were dark, and the eerie silence returned. I ventured toward the barn, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing the long table now empty, but the faint smell still lingered. I approached the head of the table where the man had stood, my flashlight revealing dark stains on the wood, blood, dried and darkened. I stumbled backward, my flashlight shaking. That's when I noticed a small door at the back of the barn, partially hidden by stacks of crates. I felt a strong urge to leave, but something compelled me forward. Behind the door, a staircase led down into darkness. With every step, the air grew colder, the sweet metallic smell thickening. Then I heard footsteps above. I shut off my flashlight, pressing myself against the wall. Voices murmured from the top of the stairs, their words too faint to make out, but I knew I'd been discovered. I needed to escape, but every step felt heavy, as though the air itself was holding me back. Just as I reached the top of the stairs, the tall figure from the night before appeared in the doorway, his face twisted in an unsettling smile. "You came back," he said softly. "You must be very curious." I didn't wait for him to finish. I shoved past him, bolting through the barn and out into the woods. My car wasn't far, but each second felt like an eternity. I threw myself inside, barely able to catch my breath, and sped away, vowing never to return. Back in town, I tried to tell my editor what I'd found, but he dismissed it as sensationalism. And as the weeks passed, it became clear that no one wanted to hear about Boulder Pines. The town seemed eager to forget, as though the place itself was nothing more than a shadow. But sometimes late at night I catch a whiff of that sweet metallic smell, and I can almost hear the chanting again. I know the people of Boulder Pines are still up there, hidden in the woods, practicing their twisted rituals, and I know they're waiting for the next curious visitor who won't be lucky enough to escape. The Siren of the North Shore. My grandfather used to tell me stories of strange things that happened on the North Shore near Halifax, Nova Scotia. He swore there were places along the coast where the line between this world and the next was paper thin, where the ocean called to people with voices not their own. I never really believed him, until last fall. I had returned to Halifax to settle some family affairs after my grandfather's passing. One night, feeling restless, I decided to take a drive along the North Shore. The rocky cliffs and fog-covered waters were hauntingly beautiful under the dim light of the moon. There was a heaviness in the air, and as I drove, I felt an inexplicable urge to stop near an old, abandoned lighthouse that my grandfather had always warned me about. I parked the car, staring at the dilapidated structure that had weathered countless storms. The locals said it was cursed, that it had been the site of mysterious drownings over the years, yet no one could agree on the details. Some blamed accidents, others said it was a magnet for misfortune. Either way, I felt compelled to investigate. As I approached, I heard something strange, a faint melodic singing coming from somewhere near the water. It was a woman's voice, soft and hypnotic, carrying across the waves. My rational mind tried to tell me it was just the wind, but there was an unmistakable rhythm to it, a haunting melody that seemed to seep into my bones. Before I knew it, I was following the sound down a path that led to the shore, my feet moving as if on their own. The closer I got to the water, the louder the singing became. I scanned the shoreline but saw no one. The moonlight cast long shadows across the rocks, giving the place an eerie glow. Then, I saw her, a woman standing by the edge of the water, her back to me. Her long, dark hair flowed down her back, and she wore an old-fashioned dress, tattered and wet, clinging to her figure. "Hello?" I called, my voice barely above a whisper. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge my presence. She just kept singing, a melody that was both beautiful and heartbreakingly sad. Against my better judgment, I took a few steps closer, feeling an overwhelming urge to hear the song more clearly. As I got closer, a sense of familiarity washed over me. Something about her presence felt known, as if I'd seen her before. That's when I realized I was standing on the exact spot my grandfather had described in his stories, a place where, he'd said, the lost come to lure the living. Suddenly, she stopped singing. The silence was deafening, the air thick with tension. Slowly, she turned to face me, and my heart nearly stopped. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark, filled with a sadness that seemed to stretch across lifetimes. But it wasn't just her sadness that chilled me. It was the fact that her face looked familiar, like an old family photograph I couldn't quite place. I took a shaky step back, but my foot slipped on the wet rocks and I stumbled. When I looked up, she was gone, as if she'd melted into the night. The only sound was the crashing of the waves against the shore. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. Had I imagined her? Was this just grief playing tricks on me? Back at the car, I struggled to shake off the experience. I'd convinced myself it was just a figment of my imagination, a manifestation of the stories my grandfather had drilled into my head as a child. But as I started the engine, a single thought crept into my mind. What if she'd been waiting for me? Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I tried researching the lighthouse, looking up old news articles, but found nothing specific about drownings or hauntings. Then I stumbled on an entry in my grandfather's journal that caught my attention. It mentioned a woman named Eliza, a distant relative who had supposedly disappeared on the North Shore under mysterious circumstances in the 1800s. The entry was brief, but he wrote of rumors that she'd been in love with a sailor who'd never returned from his last voyage. Heartbroken, she'd spent her nights by the shore, waiting for him until she too vanished, presumably swept out to sea. A shiver ran down my spine as I remembered the woman I'd seen. Her face, her expression, they matched an old, fading photograph of Eliza I'd seen in one of my grandfather's albums. The resemblance was too striking to ignore. Had I somehow seen her spirit that night by the lighthouse? Determined to find closure, I returned to the North Shore the following evening, bringing the photograph with me. The air was thick with fog, and the ocean was unusually still, as if holding its breath. I walked back to the spot where I'd seen her, holding up the photograph as if it could somehow connect us. "Eliza?" I called softly, feeling a bit foolish but unable to resist. At first, there was nothing, but then from somewhere in the mist, I heard that same song, faint and haunting. My heart pounded as I scanned the shoreline, and there she was again, standing by the water's edge just as before. This time she turned to face me immediately, her sad, dark eyes locking onto mine. She lifted her hand, pointing toward the water, her expression pleading, almost desperate. I took a hesitant step forward, feeling an inexplicable urge to follow, but a sudden wave of fear broke the spell, and I stopped, realizing that whatever she wanted, it wasn't something I was ready to give. She held my gaze for a long, silent moment, then slowly faded into the mist, her form dissolving as if she'd never been there. The singing stopped, leaving only the sound of the waves and the eerie, empty silence. I walked back to my car, feeling an odd mix of relief and sorrow. I knew she was my ancestor, and I could feel her sadness, her loneliness. But I also knew I couldn't join her, couldn't fulfill whatever strange destiny she believed was ours to share. Now, whenever I drive along the North Shore, I still catch glimpses of her in the mist, standing by the water, waiting. And sometimes, just sometimes, I can hear her song drifting over the waves, a reminder that some souls never stop searching, even across generations. Thank you for joining us tonight. As we leave behind these haunted places and restless spirits, remember, some mysteries aren't meant to be solved. If you enjoyed these tales of eerie art, hidden secrets, and voices from beyond, Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you'll be ready for our next journey into the unknown. Until then, stay curious and stay safe. You never know what might be watching from the shadows.